Hello and welcome to this special programme that is dedicated to the Holocaust to mark International Holocaust Memorial Day. So we are live, we are interactive, and the question I'll pose to you today is, have we forgotten the lessons of the Holocaust? And to discuss this very important and essential topic, I'm joined by Trudy Gold from JW3, historian and an educator. Firstly, Trudy, welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Simon.
And also want to say thank you so much for your help over the years. And I've interviewed two fascinating survivors of the Holocaust over the past 2 weeks, thanks to you. And it's so important to get these survivors, and there's not many left to tell their stories on record. So, and also want to thank you so much for the work that you've done in pioneering Holocaust education in this country. And you know, we owe you a debt of gratitude for bringing this to the forefront of public opinion. So thank you for all your work you've done.
Thank you so much for your kind words.
Trudy, where should we start? I think I would like to start this programme. As I was in the European Parliament yesterday, I recorded a programme called the European Report there. It's about Israel and the Middle East. In the European Parliament yesterday, there was the Parliament put on an International Holocaust Memorial event. Had a lot of press coverage, there were a lot of cameras, they invited special guests. Now, what astonished me this time, and this is not to belittle the Romani gypsies, but the whole memorial service was dedicated to the Romani gypsies. I think over 28,000 were murdered by the Nazis, and what happened to them was absolutely horrific. But it took centre stage, and there was a survivor, a Jewish survivor from Auschwitz, and I was very concerned because I thought it was a time of rising anti-Semitism. Essentially, the Holocaust is about the mass murder of the Jewish people on an industrial scale. Are we beginning to forget what the Holocaust was actually about?
The first thing I want to say is what happened to the Roma is appalling, and what continues to be appalling is the way they are treated. Having said that, I have noticed over the past few years what I call the Dejudaization of the Shoah. It's happening. It's happening. We are now on Holocaust Memorial Day. We don't just remember the victims of the Holocaust, we remember the victims of every genocide. Now let me state very carefully and very firmly, every life lost in horror is an abomination to man and to the Almighty. Having said that, I think there are some very strange forces at work behind what I call the Dejudaization of the Holocaust. And really, to start, you have to go to the world of psychology. If you want to begin to understand what happened in Europe, the best educated, most cultured nation in the world decided that birth was sentence of death for the Jewish people. And by and large, apart from an extraordinary group of amazing rescuers, the rest of Europe stood by and let it happen. Now, what happens when something like that is revealed to the world? Well, when the camps were liberated, there was a lot of platitudinous sorrow. When some survivors went home, I don't know if you know this, Simon, but for example, when survivors went back to Poland, it was a terrible time. There was civil war, life had become very cheapened. The Poles themselves suffered so appallingly, and yet 500 Holocaust survivors, over 500 Holocaust survivors, were murdered within a year by Polish fascists. And that led to the Brika movement, and eventually this, of course, became part of the population of the State of Israel. Now, step back. What happens when you realise this kind of atrocity is permeated in the West on your territory? And I think what happened was a lot of people felt very guilty, and also felt very sorry for the Jews. But gradually, people also began to feel that, why should we go on feeling sorry for the Jews? And I think something very interesting happened with the state of Israel. When Israel was created as a state, in the early years, it was the darling of the left, little embattled Israel. And then, as you well know, in 1967, Israel made a terrible mistake. They won a war. Saul Bellow said that if Israel had lost, the world would have sent 30,000 blankets to the surviving Jewish orphans. By winning a war, David became Goliath. And of course, by winning that war, Israel became the proud possessor of Palestinian Arabs who had been put in refugee camps. A tragic story. But please don't forget the 800,000 Jews who had to leave their homes in the Arab world. They are never mentioned. So all of a sudden, you begin to see a change in language. And may I also point out, it's very important to understand where this kind of anti-Semitic language begins to come from. And it's a two-pronged attack. I don't know if you know this, but after Nasser came to power in Egypt, quite a few high-ranking Nazis went to work for his regime, including some who had worked for Goebbels. The same thing was happening in Syria. So you had the build-up, ironically, of Nazi anti-Semitism in the Arab world, and something else, Russia. Although Russia was one of the first countries to recognize Israel, and in 1949, the Daily Worker had a wonderful article saying how we must support the Jewish state. Russia, Stalin changes his mind. He changes his mind for many reasons. Number one, because when Golda Meir went to Russia as the first ambassador from the socialist Jewish state, 50,000 young Jews came out to greet her after religion is dead in Russia. Stalin has a Jewish problem. So gradually, you begin to see in Pravda and Izvestia the beginnings of anti-Semitic propaganda. The Jews are seen as rootless cosmopolitans, and not only that, particularly after the Arabs are courting the Russians and the Russians are courting the Arabs, think of the Asfandam, what happens is you get the other prong of anti-Semitism. That comes from Russia. So it's moving on in the Arab world. Psychologically, I think in Europe, all of a sudden, do we have to feel sorry for Israel anymore? And after all, haven't the Jews bleated on about it a bit too much? So I think that's where the seeds were. We didn't see it coming. I think that's the other point. You've got to remember also that there is a strong opinion, of liberal opinion in the West as well, that did feel very sorry about the Shoah and did try to make amends. Somehow, though, the Shoah captured everybody's imagination for good or bad. I don't know if it was the fascination with evil. So it wasn't just the great textbooks, the survivor testimonies, it was films, it was articles, it was books. So it becomes one of the most discussed, widely read about subject that you can possibly imagine. In the year 2000, 60 countries came together in Stockholm. It was the first ever meeting of the third millennium. Already Britain had put Holocaust studies on the core curriculum. It was happening in quite a few other countries as well. In addition to that, the Swedish government, who actually called together the meeting, the Prime Minister had realised there was still anti-Semitism in Sweden, and he thought, well, if we teach the Holocaust carefully, then maybe it will all disappear. So you did have the development of what was then called the ITF, the International Task Force. And the idea was to teach about the Holocaust throughout Europe as a way of, and in America, as a way of making people more sensitive to racism, xenophobia, to take the lessons of the Holocaust and make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. But unfortunately, it has gone horrifically wrong. There is a lesson in the Holocaust. When society becomes fractured, when there is political, social, and economic turbulence, people become tribal and they look for a scapegoat. And tragically, whether we like it or not, in the world of monotheism, the world of Christianity and the world of Islam, the Jew today makes the perfect scapegoat. They've taken a Levitical concept, and all the ills of the world have been pushed not just onto the Jews, but also onto the state of Israel. I find it fascinating, and I don't want to discuss politics with you. I'm not talking about political regimes. I'm not talking about the West Bank. I'm talking about the essence of the state of Israel. Is Israel really the most appalling country in the world? Why is it that there have been more resolutions passed against the Jewish state than any other nation? Are we saying its human rights record is the worst of the lot? Israel is a democracy. And I don't think many people realize what's going on in the Israeli field hospitals, how they're helping the Syrian refugees. It seems as though Israel can do no right. And anti-Semitism today is three-pronged. It's coming from the fascist right, where it's always been. It's now coming from the left, and I would say some liberal opinion, and of course from militant Islam. So that's the three-pronged attack that we are facing, and I think this is one of the reasons you begin to see the de-Judaization of the Shoah. And there's a further, if I may say one other thing, you yourself know how important survivor testimony is.
Absolutely.
And I know that when survivors go into schools, they make a huge impact. And I've discussed this with some of the survivors. And you know what they say to me? They see us as people, and they feel very sorry for us, and they like us. But they're not being taught any Jewish history. They don't see the Shoah as being part of Jewish history. There's no connection. And that's another reason why I think we're in a rather dangerous place.
What was surprising, you mentioned in this earlier, in what you said, Trudy, the fact that when it comes to Holocaust education, films, books, it's become a huge industry. And even in recent years, there's been incredible number of films about the Holocaust, the Shoah, you know, including like the famous one like Schindler's List, The Notebook, Defiance, and there's many other Hollywood blockbusters that have actually covered this, that brought this subject to the forefront of the public throughout the world. And we were seeing Holocaust education taught in our schools, thanks to you and your hard work. This is on the national curriculum. We have International Holocaust Memorial Day in this country and around the world. And yet, why is it that Holocaust education has probably never been so widely spread, and yet we're seeing such a rise in Jew hatred?
That's what I'm saying to you. We've dejudaized it. The Holocaust happened to these tragic victims. What has that got to do with Jews today, and what's that got to do with the state of Israel? So the Jews can go back to being number one scapegoat. Now let's be careful. What I think you see in this country is the rise of xenophobia. Because we are in a very dislocated time, come on, think about it, Brexit, America, the crashing of all the certainties, and I think economically quite a lot of people are suffering. Where is the stability? I was brought up in the 60s. I was at university in the 60s. It was such a hopeful generation. What sort of hope is there for young people today? They can't afford houses. They don't know the certainty of their jobs. We live in a technological age which I think is making people even more isolated. I find it fascinating. When I travel on the tube, nobody's talking to each other. They're talking to machines. That's another lesson of the Shoah, is it not? When technology takes over from humanity. So as a result of that, you go back to the classic pattern that I talked about before. You don't want to blame yourself or your society or your family. Who are you going to blame? Well, blame the perennial scapegoat. Let's be careful. I mean, every society at different times has different scapegoats. But the one continuous scapegoat in the Christian world has always been the Jews. And you and I well know, we've discussed this before, we well know the reasons for that. I mean, I also want to be very careful and say that I do not believe every Christian is an anti-Semite. Of course I don't. Christianity is a religion of love, which I have great respect for. But what I do know is the negative stereotype is so deep in society that even though the Shoah was one of the greatest examples of powerlessness in history, and although there's only about 14 million Jews in the world, when people think of Jews, they think about money, they think about power. So, you know, there's a wonderful conversation between Freud and Einstein, two of the most famous refugees in history. I think it was in 1931. The League of Nations asked Einstein to go into communication with another intellectual on what is this psychosis of war. And Freud wrote back and he said, only if we can harness our irrational side has humanity got any hope. And they discussed trying to create a kind of humanistic or religious system that actually could inculcate values and make people be aware of arguments, differences, and not be threatened by them.
But we are living in a society now that is becoming so politically correct, and yet because of the way that technology is impacting our everyday lives with our phones and that constant communication, and people are now having a voice through social media, we're seeing an increase in hatred. Yeah, and also seeing, for example, these giant internet companies doing nothing to bring any form of censorship or self-control in. Isn't that fueling a lot of this hatred?
Of course it is. We can't monitor social media. It's a terrible problem. How you control that, I don't know. And it kind of permits people to say the most appalling things that they wouldn't say to other people's faces. But having said that, the level of hostility face-to-face between groups is also increasing. It's really a backdrop to the dislocation of society. You know, there's a wonderful quote, I can't remember who said it. Jews are the canaries in the mine. When they get uneasy, there's something very uneasy in the state. And believe me, Jews in Europe are uneasy, the majority of them are. Ironically, as a counter to that, it's interesting to look at Chinese civilization or look at Hindu civilization. They don't have problems with the Jews. On the contrary, they've taken the stereotype and they've rather said, well, we rather like it. So philo-Semitism, anti-Semitism, you know, it is fascinating. So going back to my original point, I think it's too deep to put a sticking plaster over. It's going to take an incredible amount of serious education. You know, ironically, all the lessons you ever want anyone to learn is in Holocaust studies. But we're not learning them and we're not teaching the right lessons. And I'm saying that as somebody who's been involved for 40 years. So I say mea culpa too.
Also, do you think the impact of the first-hand accounts now, because the survivors are now getting very old, they're in their 80s, in their 90s, there's very few that can have that personal hand account of what happened and to educate and inform the next generation, as it were. So what's going to happen when there are no more survivors to tell their story? I know that we've archived interviews, we've got the Shoah Foundation to keep these memories alive. Maybe their parents or their grandchildren will continue to tell their story, but it won't have the same impact. What happens then?
Well, that's another problem. As I said before, I think one of the problems with survivor testimony, which I am hearing from some survivors, by the way, is that although people really do listen to them and take it on, it's not indenting anti-Semitism. That's the problem. Now, how much more so will it be when they're no longer with us? Frankly, second generation, third generation, it will never have the same impact. We can watch them on screen. Does that have the same impact as live interaction? I don't know. I think we haven't yet, just as we haven't come up with a formula to civilize people and to make them more humanitarian, we haven't come up with a formula. There's lots of organizations that come up with different solutions, but I don't think any of them will ever be as good as sitting face to face with somebody who's been to hell. Having said that, they're not necessarily taking the message that survivors want them to take.
Shall we watch a video that I recorded only last week on the Middle East Report with a fabulous woman. Her name is Susan Pollock, and here's an extract of her story of how she survived the horrors of the Holocaust.
I was placed in a large barrack, in a large, which is still there, in Birkenau, and the girls, the Hungarian girls, some of them who had been transported before us, asked me, "What happened to your mother?" And I said, she was selected with a group of young mothers and many children and their babies. Oh, well, she was gassed. And I never cried. It just emotions seized up within me. I was dehumanized from the moment I was landed in Auschwitz. There was nothing familiar. Everything was unknown. It wasn't operating. There was no moral justification for anything that they were doing to us. Why? And so I wasn't thinking. I became a robot, just doing what I was told to do. Don't speak. And when you do, whisper, because you weren't allowed to speak. And what that meant, this selection in front of him, meant death if we don't pass. So we behaved accordingly. Little girls. On one occasion, I was selected, but I wasn't fearful anymore. I just acted. Selected for slave labor for a short while. For a short while, sent to a large German city, Guben, I think it was called, because no one told me anything. We were just walking and listening. There was no information, no reliable information, no information at all, because no one had any information. You weren't allowed to express yourself. When the Allied forces were coming close, I think, we were sent on this death march in the winter 44-45.
Can you describe what conditions were like at the munitions factory? What kind of, I mean, please can you give us an understanding, did the Germans give you any food to eat? And, you know, what did you eat, and how did you manage to keep your spirits up under what I can only describe as hell on earth?
Well, of course, it had improved. The food, the quality and the quantity of the food in this working camp had improved because we had nothing in Auschwitz. A little scrap of bread in the morning if we were lucky, and maybe some dishwater type of soup in the evening. So we were losing weight. Here, I was doing some work. And we marched up to the factory every morning. People who had seen us, under guard, of course, always, and nobody came to help us or anything. But the quality and the quantity of the food had improved. So, and of course, we were in a guarded area, and I think we slept in. I don't really have much recollection. But we had somewhere to sleep indoors. Yeah, we did. Just like animals, going to work, getting some food, walking back.
Do you think the local German population understood what was happening, particularly these horrendous concentration camps and forced slave labour? Do you think the local communities were aware of what was happening to you and the other Jewish people?
Definitely. They were aware. They must have been aware, because we walked. We were in that big city. They could see we were slave laborers. And many of the large German companies, who are still in existence, had used us. I mean, I was doing work, for instance, that showed me some simple checking, testing, some instruments. It was made for somebody, and and quite a few of the German companies had knowledge that the slave laborers, us, should have a function.
And you can see Susan's interview next month on the Middle East Report, and trust me, it's a powerful and compelling interview, and a very, very special lady, and Holocaust survivors are very, very special people. To actually get the opportunity to hear their stories are remarkable. Right, we got one email from Jason. He says, evening, and ma'am, Jason, it says, Jason Phillips in Lowestoft here. I'm happy to be watching the programme at present, as it's such a strong subject that affects all of us. I do not pity the Jews, but stand with them. As having grown up at school being bullied, I can fully understand what Israel and the Jews might be thinking or feeling. It may seem that Israel and the Jews are being bullied worldwide, left, right and centre, but God is with them, God has chosen them, and I'm proud to be very pro, as opposed to anti-Semitic. So very pro-Israel, and I will always stand with Israel, as I will always appreciate the Jews. So thank you for that one, and please do feel free to email in to Trudy and myself on the issue of the Holocaust as we approach the International Holocaust Memorial Day. What's interesting from, you talked about Christian anti-Semitism before, but when Christians really understand the Word of God and they really understand the Scriptures, they come into a realization that the Jewish people are very special people, and they see the hand of God upon the nation of Israel and upon the Jewish people, and you are then compelled to stand with the Jewish people.
That is a lovely sentiment, but it's not the sentiment of many Christians. Don't forget that there is this passage in Matthew's Gospel. Pontius Pilate washes his hands of the death of Jesus, and the crowd take it on, and they say, "It be on our heads and upon our children for all generations." It wasn't until the 60s that the Vatican actually said, we no longer blame the Jews for the death of Jesus. Think about good old Martin Luther. We're celebrating an anniversary last year. Martin Luther, in 1543, he wrote the most scurrilous anti-Semitic pamphlet concerning the Jews and their lies. So, whereas there are very good people like you and your colleagues, there are also those who believe that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, who they think obviously is God. Therefore, the Jews are guilty of deicide, which is the greatest crime in history. And that's where you get the devil element come into it. You see, prejudice is a fascinating study. What does it mean, prejudgment? Every kind of prejudice has a unique feature and a common feature. Depending on which society you're talking about, you can be prejudiced against any group, but the point about the Jews, the prejudice against the Jews, is always connected with money and power, because only a devil has power. So even though you don't think about it consciously, that's where it comes from.
And I just want to touch on one issue, and that's really going back. I mean, I think it's 73 years now, isn't it, since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, when the world became fully aware of the absolute murderous spirit by the Nazis during World War II. I mean, they were obsessed with the murder of the Jewish people. How was that ideology, that hatred that was personified in Hitler, able to sweep over the entire German government at the time, which then led to Nazi invasion across Europe, and the whole program of the Nazi occupation of Europe was to find the Jews and to round them up.
So you are really asking the big question: how did the Holocaust happen? Philosophically, will we really understand? Because it means getting to the soul of man. I can tell you the factors that led to it happening, that made it a possibility. And I think the first one to talk about is, in the 19th century, you see very much the collapse of the old empires, the rise of modern nationalism, huge dislocation of life, urbanization, incredible population explosion, I had a wonderful tutor who used to say to me, imagine you were born in 1800 and you died in 1900. Now, in this dislocation of life and the growth of nationalism, think about the Habsburg Empire at the centre of Europe. 15 different groups, the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Slovaks. Why on earth should they all be ruled? And out of that, you've got to remember this coincides with the French Revolution, with the Enlightenment, which was the first. In Europe, it led to the emancipation of the Jews. And you've got to remember, the Jews were emancipated finally into European society as citizens of the countries in which they live of the Jewish religion. Give up your nationhood, you are a religious group. And basically, that is what the Jews said. In France, they were loyal. In Britain, they were loyal. Britain's slightly different. It's a longer, slower process. Germany, Habsburg Empire, loyal to German culture, interestingly enough. So, what spun off nationalism, chauvinist nationalism, was the growth of racial ideas.
Yes.
My group is better than yours by blood. It starts with French aristocrats, dispossessed by the revolution. It spreads anywhere where people are insecure. So when Germany is finally unified by 3 wars, it already has a very strong racial identity. You know, the term race, which of course we would find very spurious, was very acceptable in the 19th century. And what was Germany? Look, Bismarck, the Chancellor, he was a total authoritarian. He ruled by imperial decree. He was not an anti-Semite, but he said this: even though I'm not an anti-Semite, I will do nothing to stop the growth of modern anti-Semitism because of its courageous stand against liberalism and socialism. So the irony, the Jews are now emancipated in Germany, they are citizens of Germany, and they're acting as individuals. And they're doing everything they can to be successful citizens in Germany. And you have this incredible love affair. And you also have an incredible Jewish success story. They were under 1% of the population. They went into what we call visible employment patterns, because never real power, but visible employment patterns. They were really, in many ways, the arbiters of modernity. If you look at the growth of department stores, you look at the growth of the furniture business, the medicine, law, physics, the new science of physics, very much a province of the Jews. They were not in the main in the military, they were not the great landowners, they were certainly not in the church, and they were not the German aristocracy. But they are believing, and they're emancipated under the Enlightenment, so Jews believe everything's going to get better. So what you've got a country insecure in its own nationalism, with a group, and it's in Germany that the term anti-Semitism was coined. It was coined by a German journalist called Wilhelm Marr, who created the League of Anti-Semites, and it means Jew. It doesn't matter whether you converted to Christianity, and a lot of Jews did convert to Christianity, some because of religious beliefs, and others because it's the religion of civilized people. That's a quote from Moses Mendelssohn's son, when he writes a letter to his daughter, who of course was sister to Felix Mendelssohn. So, according to anti-Semitism, it's racial. The Germans are a race, the Jews are a race. No Jew can be a German. No Jew can be a Frenchman. You also see the rise of anti-Semitism in France, the Dreyfus affair, again, dislocation of life. Well, however, Jews had thrown in their lot with the Enlightenment. And after all, the end of the 19th century, it's the greatest century we've ever seen. So things will get better. People will realise that we're useful citizens. They will come to love us. It's what Heine calls the one-sided love affair. However, then you come to World War I. Look, we've just commemorating the 100th anniversary. 1.1 million men dying at the Battle of the Somme. The harnessing of modern technology to mass murder. The century of progress in the West led to trench warfare. And also at the end of the war, it killed so much of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And at the end of the war, think what happened in Germany. The Allies wanted blood. The Treaty of Versailles, even though the Kaiser had abdicated and you had a new reformed German government, the German economy was such that recovery was impossible. And the German currency it just got completely out of control. The government had to print 2,000 printing presses to cope with it. So against the backdrop of misery And I'm sure you've all seen the pictures of wheelbarrows of money. And in that horror, where there's economic, social and political discontent, you had the growth of a devil-may-care society, almost a decadent society, if you want to put it that way. And another important point, just as many Jews had prominent positions in banking, etc., there was quite a few young Jews who'd left their Judaism behind, who were involved in revolutionary movements. And when Russia and Germany signed a peace deal, who did the German High Command sign with? They signed with a young revolutionary, a man called Lev Davidovich Bronstein, better known as Trotsky.
Oh, yeah.
He saw himself as an international man. Many Germans saw him as a Jew. Many Jews, young Jews, had been involved in revolutions in Germany before the first democratic government came to power. So you have all these forces at work in a country that had its first democratic election in 1919. Weimar couldn't hold it together. They could not control the private armies. You had the left and the right, and then you had the rise of this brilliant dictator who had completely swallowed anti-Semitism. He really believed the Jews were the other. Hitler didn't use anti-Semitism. He really believed the Jews. Look, Hitler had a completely diseased mind. All you've got to do is read Mein Kampf. How did he manage to achieve power? Because out of the hopelessness of Weimar, and then there was a certain recovery, but then Wall Street crashed. And you've got to think about who lost their life savings. You've got to think about middle-class people in a little village or a little town somewhere in Bavaria, and what happened to them. Street fighting on the streets, decadence in the cinemas, etc. You don't blame yourself. You've got this brilliant man who has a brilliant propaganda character, completely opposed to any kind of democracy. And in the end, he does it through the democratic process. By 1929, he's a real power in the Reichstag. And finally, in 1933, he seizes power, committed to a Judenreich. And what you see from 33 to 39 is the gradual social, legal, and political exclusion of the Jews from German society. Why did people put up with it? Well, to start with, you had a brilliant propaganda machine, plus you had a fear of communism, plus you had innate prejudice, and also fear, because once Hitler takes power, remember he said, it was on the front page of the Times, he set up a concentration camp at Dachau. Who went to Dachau? Anyone who opposed him. Yep. So you take away all the opposition. You take away church opposition, you take away political opposition, and you rule through terror. And when did he decide to murder all the Jews? Well, that's another interesting question. Up until the middle of 1941, he had a Judenrein policy. But the problem was, to leave a country, you've got to have somewhere to go. And after the Wall Street crash, countries of the world were finding it very difficult to take in refugees. Am I saying anything you don't know? So it all comes together. And also, once the war starts, you have the brutalization of people. War brutalizes people. And the propaganda, have you ever seen Nazi propaganda? Goebbels controlled every image in Germany. He controlled every newspaper, he controlled every book. There's a very scary, for anyone who believes in freedom, May the 10th, 1933, the burning of the books.
Oh, yes.
Any society that burns books will one day grow people. Now, depending on where you come from, you will give greater weight to one cause than the other. So, but I think basically, that's how it happened.
Well, we've got quite a few emails, Trudy, so you're certainly provoking our viewers to a response, which is good. This one says, "Hi Simon, the reduction of the Holocaust effect and its impact is because Jesus is a Jew and prophecies say that he is returning. As a result, anything that will reduce the effectiveness of the Holocaust reduces the likelihood that the message of Jesus will also be believed is also reduced. It's a spiritual battle and modern civilization has little understanding of what that means. And mega blessings questions. That's from Vince, so thank you for that one. This one says, anti-Jew is alive and well in the UK. 6 years ago, I was driven out of my home. I lost my Star of David on polling day. I put a drawing of it in my window place and stood under a street lamp. I was terrified. I came home, round the corner, 2 men had 3 feet up to me and kicked me. So I kicked my part 1 and 2. It found a small reward. The next thing, my car was kicked on the roof, bonnet, back and doors, done by Muslims who, in the meantime, they stalked me all over. So there's some personal experiences.
Horrible stories.
Then we have this one, sorry, it carries on. Kicked my front doors into my car. I had to sell my home for half the value to an investor because I was scared of my life. I now have to rent in the private sector with no security at 70 years young. Hatred is still very much alive. And that's from Sandra, so our hearts go out to you with that one. This one says, just a note, sorry, go on from Tommy. Tommy says, hi Simon, always so interesting to hear testimonies from Holocaust survivors and certainly insight from your main guest. Thanks to you, Simon, for not allowing us to forget in the Western world where there's a spirit of anti-Semitism and it's increasing. So thank you for that one, Tom. Just read a couple more. This one says, hello Simon and guest, just a quick note, please, did the Holocaust take place? Because that was the one. No, I'm not going to read that one. Sorry, I'm not going to read that email. This one says, having been to Israel a few times, I thank God that I've seen so many Christians from around the world who stand with Israel. Shalom and love. So thank you for that one. This one says, yeah, I'll come back to that one. No, I'll read this one. It says, hello, Revelation TV. I'd like to comment on your Holocaust live program. I feel the need to say that I am absolutely perplexed that someone as astute and as intelligent and supposedly as knowledgeable as Simon Barrett would believe that 6 million Jews were exterminated by the Nazis. Well, this is a kind of questions you get, but when you open up to live interaction. Now,
what does that person need? How many more films, documents? I think Holocaust denial, you see, that's another extraordinary thing. There's been trials. Yes. There has been so much proof that it happens. But then on the other hand, people aren't rational, are they?
No, no. When you've got the evidence in front of you, people don't want to hear it or actually want to see it. I suppose you just spoke there about Germany and all the factors that led up to the Holocaust as well. But I mean, also the evil of the Nazi regime were more obsessed with finding Jews and having the SS death squads round up Jewish people and then forcing the local populations to cooperate in this one. Was there any chance of any kind of opposition within those countries to what the Nazis were doing?
Well, that's interesting.
Apart from Mavericks.
Okay, I think you've done quite a lot of work on rescuers. The majority of rescuers had restless, they did have reckless personalities, didn't they? They were Mavericks. They weren't very, in the main, they weren't used to obeying orders. I think probably it's the same kind of character that wins the VC, actually. They're the group we need to study. They're the group that make us feel better. Okay, was there opposition? Well, Hitler could have been stopped up until 1933 outside of Germany. He could have probably been, you've got to see his foreign policy was push, pull, push, pull, push, pull. Yep. He'd go ahead, see if but then of course you've got to remember the catastrophe of the First World War was so appalling, nobody really wanted to risk another war, and he knew that. Now, was there opposition in Germany itself? Well, yes, there was. But what happened to anyone opposed the regime? Once you've got terror in play, how on earth, and think how they operate. All school children had to join the Hitler Youth. Children were taught to tell on their parents, what if you've been liberal before Hitler came to power? And your children came home, are you going to keep quiet or are you going to tell them the truth and risk going off to a concentration camp? The Nazis used terror and propaganda. And the other point you've got to remember is Hitler did make it better for the Germans. If you were an Aryan and you behaved yourself and you didn't criticize the regime, he got the economy going. He built the roads, he built the Volkswagens, every neat little house. He was obsessed with neatness and cleanliness. You know, Hugo Gryn once said, if you want to understand Nazism, understand he reversed the 10 commandments.
Interesting.
You kill, you steal, you covet. Nazism was a revolution. Hitler was not Christian. The inner circle were not Christian. They believed in all this race mythology. There's a wonderful quote, if I can remember all of it, of the poet Heinrich Heine. I'm paraphrasing. He wrote this in, I think, the 1840s. If the talisman of the cross will ever fall in Germany, then the hammer of Thor will rise up, and the old berserker gods will write the dust of 1,000 years from their eyes, and engulf the world in a calamity that will make the French Revolution seem like a tea party. He is referring, you see, when any people go back to its national roots, you remember Germany's not unified till 1871. Well, when was Germany great? Go back to the time of the Germanic tribes who defeated the might of Rome. Yes. Go back to the legends of the Preuski, you know, that strange tribe that inhabited what was Prussia. Go back to the legends of the Teutonic Knights. We see it as fantasy, but it was believed.
Yeah. Sadly, we've only got 3 minutes left of the programme, Trudy. I could go on for another hour with you because I find what you have to say absolutely fascinating and so engaging. I suppose really when we got 3 minutes left, so I kind of need to sum up a little bit. I suppose the main thing is, how do we keep the memory of the Shoah alive for future generations, to keep it fresh in our memory, but also then to, when we see a rise of evil and when we see a rise of anti-Semitism, not to be bystanders, but to actually confront it head on.
Well, don't forget what the great Yehuda Bauer said. Don't be a perpetrator, or don't let your children be perpetrators or your grandchildren. Don't be victims. Don't let your children be victims or their grandchildren, and don't be a bystander. You see, that's what it's about, really. Most of Europe were not evil, but it doesn't take much for evil to take over when ordinary folk step aside. Yeah, it could have been stopped.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, one of the fascinating things I've really encountered from interviewing some of the survivors, particularly people like Susan, who I interviewed, and others, is that they thought outside the box, and they were very acutely aware of what was going on in their surroundings and had to make very, very quick decisions. Is it that type of person that actually survived the horrors of war?
A lot of them will say, though, it was accident. A lot of them would say it was luck. But one thing I do know about the survivors who go into schools, they are such positive people.
Absolutely.
They know that lovely Hebrew toast, l'chaim. Despite everything that's happened to them, I don't know any of them who are bitter, except they're getting bitter about the rise of anti-Semitism, actually. Again, because can you imagine, you've been to hell, and now they're spending so much time going into schools. They're not just thinking about Jews, they're thinking about any group that's prejudiced, and that includes Muslims, by the way. So when I'm feeling really depressed, I actually have a couple of close friends who are Holocaust survivors, and they're the people I talk to. And they're the ones who put, you see, we're never going to give up. We're never going to give up this work. That's the point. It might not be going very well at the moment, but you have to go on because that's all we've got. There's a wonderful quote, I can't remember who from. It was told me by my friend Felix Scharf, who was himself a survivor, and he said this: you go on teaching because just one day you just might teach the person who changed the world.
Trudy, sadly we've come to the end of the programme, and I just want to thank you all for sending in your emails and text messages. Sorry I didn't have time to read them out, but I just want to thank you so much for being my guest and enlightening us all about Holocaust education, and as long as you're there, we stand a chance, Trudy. So continue.
Thank you for that, but there are lots of others too.
But continue the good work, and I appreciate that very much. And I just want to thank you all for watching this special live programme as we mark International Holocaust Memorial Day. I think what we can take away from this day is that we cannot forget the horrors of what happened to the Jewish people, which over 6 million precious Jewish lives were murdered on an industrial scale by the Nazi regime. So it's important to also archive Holocaust survivors so they can tell their personal accounts, so that we can pass this on from generation to generation. And let's remember that if we allow anti-Semitism to flourish, then our society and our civilization is next. So keep alert and keep praying. So thank you for watching this special program.